Hello and welcome to another week of chess openings with me, Zach Slagowski, as we explore all the main openings that you can see as a chess player beginning in the game of chess. This week we're going over the Alekhine Defense, and we're going to do a little bit of a video series throughout the next couple weeks of all the different variations that you can do for the Alekhine Defense, because there's such a wide range of different variations that you can go about and attack your opponent and win the game. So what we're going to be looking at when we do the Alekhine Defense is 6 main variations. The first being the Modern Variation, the second being the Exchange Variation, the third being the 4-pawn attack, the fourth being the 2-pawn attack, the fifth being the Samisch Attack, and the 6th variation is what happens when your opponent goes knight to c3. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the Modern Variation, which is the mainline theory for the Alekhine's Defense, and with that, let's just jump right into it. So to start off with the Alekhine's Defense, it's actually a black opening. So we're going to start on the black side. White plays e4. You need white to play e4 or else you can't really do the Alekhine's Defense. But what's nice about the Alekhine's Defense is that if they go queen 4 and you just shoot out their knight over here to g6, you can transpose into a King's Indian or a Perk defense pretty easily. So when white starts off with the e4 pawn opening, the way that you start with the Alekhine is to go to g6 here to attack the pawn. Now to do the Modern Variation, what will happen is white will then chase the knight at e5. The knight comes over to d5. d4 happens to trap the knight in, and this is where we do the Modern Variation. So there's a couple different ways that the Modern Variation can play out. We'll look at first is when white plays bishop to c4, starting with the Modern Variation. So how the Modern Variation comes up is from here we go d6. From d6, what will happen is white will need to kick out the f3. If they don't kick out the knight to f3, then it's not the Modern Variation. So then take on e5, and white will take with the knight on e5, creating a little bit of an attack fortified by this pawn and protected by this queen. Next thing we should do is kick up the pawn over here to c6, supporting the knight. And what will happen is white in this variation kicks out the bishop to c4, directly attacking the knight. What we'll want to do from here is kick out this knight over here to d7, attacking this knight, and not worrying too much about what the bishop's doing here, attacking the knight, because we have the pawn fortifying the knight there. So what we're looking to do from this variation is we're trying to kick out a knight over here to f6, and then shooting up to b5, attacking this bishop and pushing him out. And then once that happens, the nice thing about the Alekhine's Defense is there's not a lot of theory involved. It's a lot of basic openings, and then you just kind of go with the flow of the game, fight with what white gives you, and try to make the most of the opportunities that they have. The nice thing about the Alekhine's Defense is white usually doesn't encounter it, especially at a lower level, and so you can throw a lot of people off kilter when they do an e4 opening, not expecting the the f6 knight right off the bat. Quick, before we do anything else, please drop a like on the video below. It really helps me with the algorithm. Please don't let the video skip, please. Now the second variation we're going to be looking at is when the bishop goes to d3 instead of to c4. So the knight kicks out, we exchange, we support our knight, and this time the bishop comes over here to d3. What we'll want to do is kick up this pawn over here to g6 to fianchetto the bishop and create some attack lines on the knight and continue attacking, kicking the knight out here to attack the knight as here. And that's basically the whole variation. From there on out, you just play with what white gives you. The next variation is when the bishop goes to e2, which is the best move for white in this situation. And we set it up like so. Bishop goes to e2. We'll kick out the bishop to e5 before we want to close up this pawn structure here. White should castle. We'll bring out the knight to attack the knight. Knight retreats, and we can fortify the center, moving up to e6. And white will come out here and attack the knight on d5. So what we'll do is we'll retreat the knight to f6. And what we're looking at is we control the center very well as black, whereas white doesn't necessarily have the amount of control of the board as we do. Another way that the bishop to e2 can go is as we continue on, bishop comes out to e2, we kick out to f4. He attacks with the pawn here on g4 to attack our bishop on f5. We'll then retreat the bishop. They continue their pawn push. It's guarded by this bishop, so do not take with the knight. We go and attack the knight here on f6. White then can push up the pawn, and we will kick the bishop back to g8. Knight will kick out. The pawn will come up here to attack the d4 pawn. And what we're planning to do is just break open the center from this point. White can do that through en passant. White can do that by attacking here. There's many different ways we can go about it, but this is like the most theory-heavy line of the Modern Defense variation. Now, before we go, there is one trap that black has up its sleeve when it comes to the Modern Defense. We set it up from here. If white comes out here and attacks your knight on c4, this is great for us because we just kick it out to b4. If they try to attack on a3, we bring out the queen, attacking this queen here, offering a queen of trades. Now as white, what you don't want to do is you want to accept the trade, because what happens is you get a nice little royal fork, forking the king, the rook, and the queen, and essentially winning the game from there on out. There was a game where I literally got this, took the queen. For some reason after that, the king went back and I just brought the knight back out and took the rook. And from there, they just resigned right away. So it's a nice little trap to know up your sleeve, especially when it comes to inexperienced players that never see the Alekhine's defense. Last video, we went over the modern variation, which is the mainline theory for the Alekhine's defense, but there may be times where white forces your hand and you're going to encounter the exchange variation. So what does that look like going forward? To go over what we went over in the last video, the Alekhine's defense is a black opening where when white goes to e4, black moves its knight to g6. The white pawn will move up to e5. We evade it by going to d5 with the knight. White moves its pawn to d4, and we bring our pawn up to d6, challenging the pawn here on e5. Now, in the modern variation, they bring their knight out here to f3, but an exchange variation is when white brings the pawn over here to c4, attacking the knight and forcing it to retreat over here to b6. Now from here, they can continue this attack, which would be kind of foolish for them. So the best thing for them to do is to take the pawn over here on d6, and we take with the e7 pawn. The reason we don't want to take with the c6 pawn is it traps our bishop in from developing quickly. By taking with the e7 pawn, we open up both our bishop lines and are able to develop in a much quicker way. Now, there are 4 main exchange variations, all developing on what happens on the 7th and 8th move. So on the 6 moves, it will always go white moving its knight to c3, we moving our bishop to e6, creating a block of the king and also opening up an attack line here and fortifying this pawn as well. Now, the first variation we're going to be looking at is what happens when white moves its bishop to e3, fortifying this pawn and creating an additional layer of attack on the knight. When this happens, all we want to do is castle and continue playing from there. We do not want to take directly here because the bishop is watching this pawn. We might want to look at something where we're going to move our pawn over here to c5, but what we want to do is get this king out of danger right away. The second variation is on the 7th move, the bishop going to d3, and on the 8th move, we're going to look at the knight going to g2. So the knight falls back, the pawn comes through, we take with the e7 pawn, knight to c3 comes out, we go bishop to e7, and this time, instead of going bishop to e3, we get bishop to d3. We're still going to castle. White should bring its knight over here to e2, fortifying this pawn and creating a potential attack patterns. We bring out our knight to also bring a threat to that pawn. White castles. We bring the rook to take control of this file, and white continues to fortify this pawn chain right here. We kick up this pawn here to try to disrupt this pawn structure later on. And from here, white has like a half pawn advantage, and the queen side is the most overloaded part of the board, where there's about to be a showdown in a number of different ways. The nice thing about the Alekhine is there's not a lot of theory behind it. This is like probably the most theory heavy, this is just offering you a good starting point of what to do in these situations. Next, we're going to be looking at the bishop to d3 and knight to f3 variation. So we go through exchange, bring the bishop over here to e7, and we get the bishop to d3. We castle, and this time they bring the knight over here to f3 instead of bringing the knight to f3. Still defending this pawn here. We will kick out this white light squared bishop to open up attack lines here, and white will push up the pawn to b3. We can kick it up to d5 here to break open the center, because now we have 3 attackers compared to the 2 defenders here. White can then push, attacking our knight, causing us to retreat and bringing us more inward. Another variation that we can look at from here is if when we go to bishop to e6, we get, instead of going to b3, we can get queen to e2, staring down on this weakness of the bishop. What we'll want to do is bring in the rook. White will castle. We'll bring out that bishop to attack this pawn, even though it is covered by the knight. Blue will bring an extra defender of that pawn, and we'll push up trying to open the center. White then pushes up attacking the knight. We then thrust ourselves in. Even though we're attacked by the bishop, we have the pawn defense here and are creating attack lines in multiple different ways, attacking the bishop, attacking that pawn. White should take. We take with our pawn, and white should move the rook over to from a to d1. Black then moves its bishop over here to d5, attacking this knight. White will then move up its knight to e5, and we add an additional attacker on that square by bringing up our knight to c6. And we'll take this pawn over here on e4, fortified by the knight, so the rook doesn't want to take it, but it's also forking the knight and the bishop. The nice thing about this is if white forgets that this bishop is guarding this queen, we get a nice free queen there. Next, we're going to look at the best variation for black, and that is when on the 7th move, knight goes to f3. So we do the exchange, we bring our bishop to e7, and white brings up the knight to f3. We then castle. White brings its bishop over here to e2. We bring our bishop over here to attack this pawn. If white pushes here to attack the bishop, we kick out over here to f4. And if they try to kick the bishop, we just trade the knight for the bishop. That puts us at our half-point disadvantage in the most advantageous position for black. All in all, the exchange variation favors white heavily, but these lines will serve to help you as much as possible to get as equal as possible in your games moving forward. In this video, we're going to be looking at the 4-pawn attack. It's a very scary looking opening when you're playing it as black, and you might not know what to do at first. And this video will hopefully guide you on how best to combat this scary attack. So to start off, as we have with all our Alekhine videos, is how to do the Alekhine defense. It starts with an e4 pawn opening from white. We go knight to f6. They chase the knight on e5. We move the knight over here to d5. White will then move its pawn over here to d4, and we bring the pawn to d6, attacking the e5 pawn. Now, where the 4-pawn attack comes in is when white goes to c6, attacking the knight. Very similar to the exchange variation, we go back to b6, and instead of exchanging, white adds another attacker by going to f4. Now, looking at this, it's a very scary attack. You can't necessarily take over here on c4 because the bishop's barreling down right on it, and it looks like white is really taking the center and has lots of lines of development that is going to make it hard for you to develop yourself. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get yourself into worlds of trouble. So the best thing for black to do in this situation is to take on d5. White should take from f4, and we'll want to kick out our knight over here to c6. And this is where we get the most attacking lines from this theory. We can't obviously take here or here because of the two defenders of the pawn. So what white will usually do is they'll start developing their pieces and add further defense for the pawn structure. By moving the bishop over here to e3, we'll develop our bishop to f5. They'll bring out the knight over here to c3. We will then open up our bishop line by moving our pawn over here to e6, fortifying this bishop as well. If they try to push here, we will want to move the knight over here instead of trying to take and trade with the pawn, with the queen, with the knight, whatever it is. We don't want to trade at this point. By kicking the knight out here, this knight is protected, and it looks like the white center is collapsing. Because in the next moves, at this point, we can take. Because if we take here, and they take back, we can then have two knights to attack the center, and a queen, where they only have a knight and a queen. So we'll win the center eventually, and so this is the best way of handling the 4-pawn attack right away. So in this variation, black actually has a 2-point advantage and is looking really good. We have the knight fork here to attack the king and the rook, which is defended by the bishop. It's gonna be really hard for white to stop. So the second line is the most theoretical line probably of the whole Alekhine defense. So we start off with the 4-pawn attack. We'll attack, we'll exchange, we'll bring the knight up. They'll develop their bishop to e3. We'll develop to f5. They'll develop to c3 with their knight, and we will push up to e6, opening that bishop line. White will further develop by getting that knight out to f3, and we'll develop our bishop to b7, opening up castling opportunities if we want to take it. White can then push up, attacking the knight. And by doing that, we kick our knight up here to b4 like in the other variation. White has two strong central pawns that are defended by these knights, which is a problem. White will then develop its knight to d4, attacking this bishop on f5. So what we'll need to do is retreat the bishop. White then will develop its queen, trying to attack. And it looks like at this point, black's in a really cramped position. There's not a lot of moves that it can make. If it goes here, we just trade off knights. While yes, we have a lot of defense lines with these bishops, they're not super active. Our queen is stuck. Our king needs to castle. It's in a lot of danger. The best move for black in this position is pushing the pawn to c5. Only good move for black in this position. White can en passant by going to c6. We take with the bishop, and now we're attacking the queen, which forces white to trade off the knight. And from here, we are about even. White has a very slight advantage, and it's the best way to equalize for black. So those are two different lines that you can take when seeing the 4-pawn attack. It's just to make sure that you get your knights active, attack the pawn structure as quick as possible, and try not to make too many trades early on when playing against this attack. This week, we're continuing to learn the Alekhine defense, and specifically, it's the 2-pawn attack. Probably probably the most common variation that you're going to find when you play the Alekhine Defense, and it's best to know just a couple variations that you will probably run into when playing this opening. So first, how do you play the 2-pawn attack, and how does it come about? So first, they start with an e4 pawn opening. You kick out the knight over here to f6, and the pawn will continue to chase the knight, so you move it over to d5, saving the knight, and continue your opening. At this point, you can go into the modern variation, all the different variations of Alekhine's Defense, but in the 2-pawn attack, white kicks out the pawn to c4, attacking the knight further. All that we need to do as black is to move our knight over here to b6, attacking this pawn, even though it is defended by the bishop. Now from here, there are 3 different variations that you're going to see when playing the 2-pawn attack. The first being the knight to d5, bishop to c4, and moving your pawn over to e6. The second is knight to d5, knight to c3, and moving your pawn to e6. And the last is the Alekhine Samisch Gambit. So we're going to look at all 3, starting with the knight to d5, bishop to c4, and then e6 variation. So how that happens is I will continue the pawn attack by pushing up to c5. We then will kick the knight over here to d5, saving ourselves from that attack. And this is probably the most common variation that you're going to see when playing the Alekhine Defense, especially with the 2-pawn attack, because the bishop's going to come over here to c4, attacking this knight. Now the easiest thing that you can do is just push up to e6, defending the knight. And there's 3 different ways that this variation can play out. The first is when white pushes its pawn over here to d4. We will then push up our pawn over here to b6, trying to break up this pawn chain. They will take, and we will open up the rook file here on the a file. White then kicks out the knight here like they do in the modern variation, and we move our bishop here to attack the light squared bishop and continuing the game from there. The second variation of knight to d5, bishop to c4, then moving to e3 is after the pawn attacks and we move to d5, we go to bishop to c4, we move to e6, they continue the pawn structure, we kick up, but this time they exchange instead of take the pawn. In this case, we want to take that pawn, and if they take here again, we just open up that rook file and continue on our game from there. And the last of the knight to d5, bishop to c4, and then pushing up to e6 variation that we're going to see is what happens when they bring out the knight instead of the pawn over there to d4. So as the bishop comes down, we bring up to e6. They'll bring out the knight here. The best thing that you can do is just take the knight and disrupt the pawn structure. They'll usually take with the d2 pawn, but sometimes they take with b7 and completely like disrupt the middle. That is the best thing that you can do when playing this variation. Now the next variation we're going to be looking at is when they push on the 5th move, knight to c3 instead of going bishop to c4. So after they attack our knight, we move it over there to d5 and they push over here to c3. Now there are 2 different variations that we're going to see in this. The first being when we push up to e6 defending the knight, they just take the knight there and we trade off, and they continue this 3-pawn structure right here. All we do is we push up our d6 pawn trying to attack either side. If they take one side, we push up with our pawn, and if they kick the knight out here, we just take the next pawn again, knowing that full well, if they take our pawn here, we'll just take it with the queen. So pushing up with the knight, with the pawn over here to d6 to take our other pawn isn't really advantageous for them, so they're most likely going to kick out this knight over here to f3. They then take with the pawn, and then we kick out our queen here, attacking this pawn. And then we're also looking at future moves like going bishop to b4. If they bring the bishop down here, we take with the queen, threaten the knight, and then also looking into castle. Now the second version of the knight to c3 variation is as follows. If they attack, we bring the knight out, they bring their knight up, and we follow up with e6 to support our knight. If they continue the pawn structure here, we just take with the knight and disrupt the pawn structure. And while white does have a good control of the center, we have a good counterplay by bringing our b6 pawn up there to disrupt it, opening the a file. If they kick knight to f3, we then take the bishop here and trade off our bishops. Now the last variation is called the Alekhine Samisch Gambit. It is when we go knight to d5, they go knight to c3, and then they kick the bishop to c4. So we'll show 2 different variations of what you're most likely to encounter in this gambit. After they kick up the pawn to c5, we move our knight to d5, they bring out the knight to c3, and we further our defense of the knight by moving to e6. They then bring the bishop over here to c4. B pawn will then take on c3, push up to d5, the only good move in this variation, attacking the bishop, the most likely en passant, and we attack with the pawn, looking to push up over here to d5 and kick out the bishop. The second version of this goes as follows. After they bring it up, we go to d5, they go to c3, we push to e6, they go to c4, and we just take the knight right away. They'll take it with the d pawn, opening up the d file for the queen, and then white will do the sensible bishop move to f4, defending the pawn on e5. We can then take the pawn over here on c5, and white can kick over here to queen to g4, looking to attack this g7 pawn. And we will then push up to g5, defended by the queen. And it's probably the most important part of this position. Otherwise, white is in a really good advantageous spot. It would then continue with bishop taking over here on g5. We then move the rook pinning that bishop to the queen, and if they take, we just trade queens, and we're in an even position for black. Now, there's one side note that we want to look at in the 2-pawn attack that you probably won't see very often, but it's good to know. And that's what happens with, instead of pushing over here to c5, they push up here to a4, trying to do a double attack on the knight since there's not a lot of places to go, because you can't, the knight will no longer be able to go here or here. So the only thing that we can do as black is just to move up to a5 and stop that attack right away. So if they then kick over, we move our knight over here to d5, and then we continue with the 3 variations that we wanted of today. This week, we're continuing our Alekhine Defense openings with looking at the Samisch Attack. This is a very uncommon opening that you'll encounter when playing the Alekhine Defense, but it's good to know what to do and what are the main 2 variations that you should look for when encountering the attack. So how did the Samisch Attack is as follows. After white goes to e4, we kick out our knight over here to f6. The white pawn continues to attack our knight on f6, so we move it to over here to d5, and white kicks out its knight over here to c3, offering a trade. When you see this as black playing the Alekhine Defense, you always want to take the knight, and then this is where the 2 variations will branch out from here. The first is being if white takes with the b3 pawn and when white takes with the d3 pawn, what are the 2 things you do? So when white takes with the b3 pawn, it's very important that we kick over here to d5. That's the best move for black in this position. Now there's 2 main openings that we'll see with this. It's when white does en passant and when they don't en passant on the next move. In this line, white does en passant here on d6. We will take with the c7 pawn. And so what we're looking at for black to do from here is to go knight to c6 here, kicking up to e5, and then pushing up our bishop to f6, looking to castle. And the other form of this is when they take with b3 is we kick up to d5, and they don't en passant, but they push up here to d4 instead, trying to take up as much as the center as possible. What we'll want to do is we're going to want to kick up to c5, try to disrupt the center. Knight will kick up with the knight on f3, and we will then also attack with our knight on c6, fighting over the d4 pawn. White kicks up to b2, and we will attack further by moving our bishop over here to g4. So what we're looking to do from here is just push up to e6, develop the dark squared bishop here on e7, and then castle from there on out. Now the second line of the Samisch Attack that you're going to see is when they take with d2, opening up the file for the queen on the d file. We'll push up to d6, attacking that pawn over there on e5. White will further defend the pawn on e5 there with the knight. We attack it further with our knight over there on c6. The bishop will then pin the knight to our king, and we unpin it with our bishop over here on d7. Now the best thing for white to do here is to move the queen over here to e2, for when that pawn does take, you can't take back, and we are at a disadvantage in the center position. So from here, the best thing to do is to take on e5 with the knight. They'll trade the knights. We open that up, let the queen take it. We then will push f6, attacking the queen, causing them to go back, and pushing up to e5, further closing up the center. Eventually, we'll be wanting to trade these bishops, but from here on, it's just play game. And the last line that we'll be going over is when they take with d3. We push up to d5. And after moving the knights, they push up over here to bishop to f4 instead of pushing bishop to b5. We'll then move up the queen here to get some versatility. They'll move the bishop over here to d3. And then we'll push up here f6 to open up the line for the pawn take. From there, we'll then take with the g7 pawn. And we're looking from here to go e5, attack this bishop. And then looking to go queen to f7, develop the light squared bishop over here to g4, and then castle for black. Those are the 4 main lines that you're going to see with the Samisch Attack. Again, it's not an opening that you're going to see very often with the Alekhine Defense, but it's something that you should have in your pocket just in case you do encounter it. This week, we're doing another video on the Alekhine Defense, and that is when white simply refuses to play the game and just moves knight to c3, transposing us into a Vienna game. Now, this is probably the most common variation you will see when playing the Alekhine Defense. It's also really fun to play if you have some tricks up your sleeve, which I'll be showing you today. So we're going to start off with how this looks when you're playing chess. They go e4, we move knight to f6, they then kick the knight to c3, and we're looking at a typical kind of transposition into the Vienna game. Now here's the 2 lines that you do not want to do when playing this, and they're not good for blacks, so just don't even try them. That's moving up to d5, trying to refute it, hoping that the white here will take on d5 so that we can take and trade queens like in a Scotch game, but that's just not going to happen, because what's going to happen is they're going to push to e5. We have to move the knight back. They then push the pawn up, and we'll have to take on e4, putting a cramped position for this knight and slowing development for your game as black. Their other refutation is going to d5. They push up, and then we try to go for a trade of the knights. And that doesn't work because white's 1 move ahead. We trade the knights, and from here we put the king in check and we trade bishops, but we're in not a a great opening because what happens is white has the files open and we have a broken pawn structure on the kingside castle. So it's not a good refutation for black either way. Now here's the most common thing that you're going to get with the Vienna game transposition. And it's a lot of fun because the nice thing about the Alekhine game is you throw your opponents off their kilter, especially the lower levels. And this further does that to them because they can't play the game that they want to play. After we move up to e5, transposing into the Vienna game, most white players will kick over here to c4 with the bishop. And this is the nice little trick we have here is we take the pawn on e4, just because if they take with the knight here, we have a nice little fork over here on d5, forking both the bishop and the knight and throwing white off any game plan that they had going into the Vienna game. Now there's a couple refutations for that little trick and I want to show you those here. If we do take over here on e4, and this is probably the most common refutation that white will have, is they attack our king over here on f7. We take with the king, they'll then take the knight, and then we push up over here to d5, taking up the center and harassing that knight. They'll kick back, because black is now up over half a point. We're gonna look to push our bishop over here to b4 so that we can, and get their knight rook out here so that we can effectively castle and create more attacking lines for black here. The other refutation that you'll most likely see is after taking the pawn over here on e4, white will kick out the queen over here to h5, looking to checkmate the king here. The best thing that we can do is bring our knight back here, attacking the bishop, but also defending this f7 square. After the queen takes, we then just trade off the queens, and white will kick back and we continue to develop our knight. So what we're looking to go here is we're looking to go c6, c5, and then move our knight over here to d4 to trap the bishop. That's what we're looking for. It's about an even game from here on out, and that's the best thing that we can do for this refutation. Another common thing you're gonna see when it comes to this Vienna game transposition is we're gonna see a lot of the Vienna Gambit. And so the best thing that we can do is push up to d5, as you should always do against the Vienna Gambit as black. If they take over here, we take with the pawn, attacking the knight. If they kick out the knight here, we will then develop our bishop, looking to castle possibly. And after the queen comes out here, we then take the knight, opening up the pawn and castling. That's the best thing you can do when you see the Vienna Gambit. Another common variation you're going to see is the 4 knights variation. Is after kicking up to e5, we get the 4 knights out. If they push the bishop out here to c4, we just do our little trick by moving there, and it's the same thing as before. We're forking to the 2 pieces. There's just an extra knight out here, but they are guarding each other. You'll also see in the 4 knights variation, after going to bishop to c4, while taking there, the refutation for white, when they take the pawn on f7, the king will take, knight will take, we'll then push up to d5. If they kick out the king here, we just bring it back. And what we're looking to do is push up to h6, or we can go bishop to g4 here to harass this knight. Black is clearly winning this position, so don't be afraid for this refutation. And then finally, the main line that you're going to see in this video is a 4 knights variation. But instead of kicking the bishop out to c4, you're gonna get a d4 attack, trying to control the center as much as possible. What we'll want to do is take and not just necessarily trade knights right away, but pin this knight to the king. After taking, we'll take with the b7 pawn here and can just continue developing, trying to take control of the center and playing just good solid chess from here on out. That's all you want to do in this mainline variation, is just basically play solid chess from here on out, because you're kind of out of the Alekhine at that point. You're playing the Vienna game that white wants to play. So the best way that we can counteract that when we can't play our Alekhine is to do that Frankenstein Dracula variation and really throw white off balance and take what's ours. The last video we'll be doing in the Alekhine Defense series, and that is the John Tracy Gambit. Now this is an opening that you'll probably run into because your opponent makes a mistake, and there's no content really to find on the internet. I looked up chess.com's openings database for the John Tracy Gambit, where it said this is the John Tracy Gambit, but I couldn't find any games under the John Tracy Gambit. So what I did is I started looking at the main line from what Stockfish says is the best way of looking at it. So I would say about 1 out of every 20 games you'll run into the John Tracy Gambit. So this might be something that you might want to look at. So the John Tracy Gambit starts off with white going to e4. We go knight to f6, just like in the Alekhine Defense. And instead of doing any of the normal moves that you would normally see, they go knight to f3, gambiting the pawn. What they're gambiting, I still don't know. What we want to do is we want to take it on e4. The best thing for white to do in this move is to push out the knight to d3, forcing the knight over here to d6. And then for white, the best thing for them to do is move to f4. Even at this point, black is still up a point. I do not know what the gambit is to lead to development. This is probably one of the worst gambits that white can do. We will then push up to e6. They can push up to d4, and we kick out a knight again on c6. They'll then kick up to c4 again. We move up the knight over here to e4, and the queen comes over here to c2. And from here, there's not really much of a theory to go off of. You just kind of play from here on out. There isn't a lot to really go off of. Like if we take it all the way back, one of the John Tracy Gambits that you'll see is when you do take, the bishop will come out here to c4, and what I'll do is I'll move over here to d6, attacking the bishop, and they'll usually push back, and you can kind of push up here. They develop the knight, you develop the knight again, and even at this point, you're up a point. Like there's not much to do. Just make sure that when you take that pawn, drop the knight back down here to d6 and just start developing your pieces, and you'll be best off from there on out. So that's it for the John Tracy Gambit and the Alekhine Defense series. If you like that video, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I also stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/ZachSlagowski. Next up, we're going to be going over the Ruy Lopez and all the numerous different openings and variations that you will see with the Ruy Lopez. So it's a long one. It's a doozy. I'm excited to get it started, and I'll see you then. Bye.